Hi, I'm David Miller, and I'm here with the first in a series of mini-lectures on Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. Today we'll do an overview of Volume 1. Now, as we go from Romeo and Juliet to Pride and Prejudice, we move into an age dominated by the restricted patriarchal nuclear family that we learned about when we studied Romeo and Juliet, and by the values of affective individualism. Yet it's clear at the same time that we haven't entirely left the old order behind. There are characters in Austen who still think of marriage primarily in terms of property and alliance, and those values still hold powerful sway even in the minds of characters like Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. The individualists in Jane Austen's fiction do not ignore property and alliance because they can't afford to. This theme will be made explicit early in Volume 2 in a conversation between Elizabeth and her Aunt Gardiner. You might watch for it. Characters in Jane Austen must pick their way gingerly through courtship as if it were a minefield, seeking to satisfy the claims of both love and property. Austen's novels take shape as moral and psychological comedies in which the central conflict turns on the difficulty of getting affective individualism right. If you're going to make love the basis of marriage, then courtship will need to combine two thoroughly incompatible processes, that of falling head over heels in love, and that of discerning character and estimating compatibility. To do both at once is like trying to juggle an apple, a bowling pin, and a potted palm. Good luck. Companionate marriage and the close-knit family it sustains thus have two serious problems to confront. They are still competing with the older values of property and alliance, which have by no means simply disappeared. But they must also survive the giddy extravagance and self-delusion that fuel romantic passion. Pride and Prejudice wastes no time in bringing these issues quickly to the forefront, for the novel opens with a conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet in which two things are clear. First, that serious economic anxieties drive the question of marriage, and second, that the Bennets themselves are by no means a happy couple. Before we take this analysis further, let's get that overview of the action in Volume 1. As with Romeo and Juliet, I think it'll help us to analyze the story if we start just by getting a clear sense of its shape. Let's start with the setting. The action begins on a small country estate named Longbourn, located about a mile away from the village of Meryton and about 3 miles from a much larger estate known as Netherfield Park. The county in which all this occurs is Hertfordshire, located just north of London in the south of England. We'll talk later about the other locations you see circled here as the action moves to London, Kent, Brighton, and Derbyshire. For now, let's take a look at how the characters are grouped. The principal characters in the story fall into two main groups: the Bennet family and the Bingley party. There are 7 Bennets, 2 parents, 2 older daughters, Jane and Elizabeth, a pedantic middle daughter, Mary, and 2 giddy younger girls, Lydia and Catherine, the latter best known as Kitty. The Bingley party, whose arrival from London sets the plot in motion, is comprised of 5 members: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, his friend Mr. Darcy, and his brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, husband to the older sister. To these groups we should add Mr. Collins, a cousin of Mr. Bennet's who comes to visit, and Mr. Wickham, a charming young man who turns up to join the company of militia headquartered in Meryton. Finally, we should note that the Bennets have a set of neighbors who play an important part in the story. These are the Lucases, including Sir William and Lady Lucas, their daughter Charlotte, and several younger children. And living in the village of Meryton are Mrs. Bennet's sister and her husband, Mr. Phillips, an attorney. 4 principal lines of action set these characters into motion in Volume 1, and all 4 are courtships. First, we have the courtship of Jane Bennet and Mr. Bingley, who are drawn to each other from the start. Then comes the courtship of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, who are repulsed by one another from the start, although Darcy begins to change his mind rather quickly. Third, is the courtship of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Wickham, who are drawn to each other from the start, although the relationship doesn't get far. Fourth and last is the hapless courtship of Mr. Collins, a serial wooer who begins with an eye to Jane, then proposes to Elizabeth, and is finally accepted by Charlotte Lucas. The first volume also divides into 4 equal parts, as you see here. The novel opens with Bingley's arrival to take up residence at Netherfield Park. This section, covering the first 6 chapters, culminates in 2 parallel scenes. The first ball, at which Darcy offends Elizabeth while Bingley is forming a heavy crush on Jane, and the party at Lucas Lodge, at which Darcy's interest in Elizabeth is provoked for the first time, and Bingley's growing interest in Jane is confirmed. The second movement of the plot covers chapters 7 to 12 and takes place entirely at Netherfield. Jane is invited to visit and comes down with a fever which prevents her immediate return. Elizabeth goes to stay with her sister and has several interesting skirmishes with Darcy and the others. This section ends with Darcy beginning to resist his growing crush on Elizabeth, while she does nothing to resist her growing dislike of him, and of everyone else in the group except for Mr. Bingley himself. The third movement introduces 2 new characters, Mr. Collins, who comes to seek a wife among his cousin Mr. Bennet's daughters, and Mr. Wickham, who turns up in Meryton one day, having joined the militia. Things are getting interesting, for although the story's main contrast is between Darcy and Wickham, there is a more immediate counterpoint between the new arrivals, as Mr. Collins, in his pompous absurdity, serves as a foil to Wickham's immediate charm. This contrast is developed with real subtlety in the pair of scenes which conclude the third movement and link it back to the first. For just as the first movement ended in matched scenes at the first ball and the Lucases' party, so this movement ends with a party at the Phillipses, followed by the second ball, this one at Netherfield Park. Wickham makes a great impression on Elizabeth at the Phillipses' party, in contrast to the way Darcy had offended her at the first ball, with Mr. Collins meanwhile offering steady comic relief. Then, at the ball, Wickham fails to appear, incensing Elizabeth even further against Darcy, although she nevertheless ends up dancing with him and having a strained conversation. This scene is a turning point in many respects, perhaps most of all because Elizabeth's family makes such a spectacle of themselves in public. Elizabeth refers to this as exposing themselves, which is an interesting expression. In one sense, it doesn't mean at all the same thing to Austen's character as it does to us. Nobody actually drops their trousers and moons the host at Netherfield Park. But in another sense, it does seem to mean something roughly similar, for the effect is pretty much the same as if they had. Jane and Elizabeth learn the next day that the Bingley party have returned to London and do not expect to be back. The reason for their sudden departure is left unclear and forms the subject of much speculation. But we will eventually learn that the embarrassing behavior of Elizabeth's family at the ball is what triggered their departure. This brings us to the fourth and final movement, the action in Volume 1, beginning the morning after the ball as Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth and Jane receives a letter about Bingley's departure. Speculation between the two sisters about the meaning of this turn of events alternates with Mr. Collins's further adventures in wooing, which culminate the next day in his proposal to Charlotte Lucas. She accepts him immediately. Of the 4 courtships initiated in Volume 1, notice that this is the only one brought to a successful conclusion, and that it's the only one completely lacking in either affection or regard. Here are the 4 movements we've just reviewed, and the parallels that organize them into a symmetrical pattern. The framing action is the arrival and departure of the Bingleys. Inside that outer frame, we have the 2 balls, with Darcy and Elizabeth offending one another, and inside that frame, we have the 2 neighborhood parties, hosted by the Lucases and the Phillipses. At the center of the action, we have Elizabeth and Darcy at Netherfield, warily observing one another, which is, of course, the main action of Volume 1. Next time, we'll take a closer look at the opening and closing passages in Volume 1, replacing this quick overview with some close analysis of the text, and we'll focus on the family dynamics of the Bennets, with special attention to the role of Mr. Bennet as husband and father.